I am delighted to welcome you to our grand round series. It's a mouthful. It's so nice to see so many of you here in person, and welcome to all of you joining us virtually today. The Grand Rounds lecture series brings nationally recognized thought leaders to the Georgia State University School of Public Health for dialogues that contribute to the school's mission of solving contemporary and emerging health problems. We are honored today to have Dr. Jennifer Hirsch here with us, who co-directed one of the largest ethnographic studies on college sexual health and sexual assault to date. But before we introduce our speaker, I want to take a moment to thank some people who made today possible. I want to thank our Grand Rounds Committee for their work identifying speakers for this series, as well as Dr. Jelaine Arias, who leads this committee, for her dedication and vision to making this happen. I also want to thank Marcus Cooper, Sam Fromme, Jordan Irons, and Amanda Norris for their behind-the-scenes work for putting on today's Grand Rounds. Truly, today would not be possible without them. At this time, I'd like to welcome Dr. Shannon Self-Brown, the Chair of Health Policy and Behavioral Sciences, who will introduce our speaker. Shannon?
Good afternoon, everyone. Today it's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Jennifer Hirsch, a medical anthropologist and professor of Sociomedical Sciences at Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health. Dr. Hirsch received her PhD from Johns Hopkins University in Population Dynamics and Anthropology. Dr. Hirsch is a prolific scholar. She's authored more than 80 peer-reviewed articles and has published several books and op-eds focused on her research, which span 5 intertwined domains and include the anthropology of love, gender, sexuality, and migration, sexual, reproductive, and HIV risk practices, social scientific research on sexual assault and undergraduate well-being, and the intersections between anthropology and public health. Dr. Hirsch's presentation today will focus on one of her critically important books entitled Sexual Citizens, Sex, Power, and Assault on Campus. In this book, which was named as a Best Book of 2020 by NPR, she and her co-author analyzed sexual assault and consensual sex among undergraduates in relation to the broader context of campus life. I would like to conclude this introduction by offering a warning at Dr. Hirsch's request that this talk today will include real stories of sexual assault from her book. So we do have the Victim Assistant Office directly outside the auditorium, and GSU's Victims Assistant Coordinator, Ms. Ebony Robinson, is available to assist audience members in setting up a confidential appointment should they choose. We also have some information for our online guests on the slides about how to contact this office. So I will now turn it over to the esteemed Dr. Hirsch to begin this Grand Round presentation. Thank you so much for being here.
Beautiful, thank you. Thank you for that nice introduction, and I'm so grateful to Georgia State for bringing me here. Seamus and I have visited a lot of campuses over the past couple of years, and this is, I think, the smoothest one administratively, really, so very well done. So I'm gonna open by telling you Austin's story. Austin was one of the more engaging undergraduates that we interviewed as part of the SHIFT ethnographic research. In fact, he appears in sort of the only spicy sex scene in the book, doing his part to narrow the campus orgasm gap on a hot summer night with his girlfriend. I'm not going to tell you that story here. As we interviewed him, we didn't start out by asking students about sexual assault. We asked them to tell, after getting to know you, we asked them to tell us their best and worst sexual experiences on campus. And so he told us a story that he initially described as something weird. It was his first week on campus. His roommate was somehow like already hooking up with a girl and wanted Austin to go sleep somewhere else. So Austin was sent off to that girl's room where that girl's roommate was in bed. She raised up her head and mumbled, she said, "I'm really drunk and I don't want to do anything." And like that's weird, right? That when a stranger walks into your room, the first thing that you should do is, need to do, is to establish a sexual boundary. But he didn't respect that boundary. He got in bed with her, and he started to touch her body. And then he stopped himself. He, as he recounted, he was like, nah, this isn't the thing. And so then he continued on in the interview, and we asked him, as we asked all the students, what is sexual assault? And the kids are smart, they're paying attention. So he said, it's any non-consensual sexual anything. And then he paused, and his eyes started to well up with tears. And he said, if you'll excuse me, fuck me. Because he couldn't believe that given the person he had become, he couldn't believe that he had done that. That was the moment that he labeled what he had done as a sexual assault. So that's to bring you into the story. Our work is very narrative driven. This is the outline of what with our madcap tour in the next 40 minutes. I'm going to talk a little bit about campus sexual assault as a social problem, give you just a tiny smattering of data if you're not already immersed in the topic, give you a little bit of information about SHIFT, just overall study design, but then the meat of the talk are the last 2 bullet points. Share some key ideas from sexual citizens and talk about the implications of those ideas for an audacious vision for campus sexual assault prevention. And I do just want to flag that I'm having serious imposter vibes up here, because there are a lot of really well-known sexual violence researchers in the room. And so what I bring to this, what Seamus and I bring to this, is a different perspective, because we're social scientists who have not spent our entire career focused on this. So I hope that you can hear this outsider perspective with generosity, and we're always interested in conversations across disciplines. So campus sexual assault is certainly not a new issue. I remember back 1,000 years ago when I was a college student, every year there was a Take Back the Night March. That was the only moment that it came out of the shadows. Since the Obama administration sent out the Dear Colleague letter in 2013, 2014-ish, that combined with student-led advocacy has put campus sexual assault back on the front page as a public issue. And so we came into this work thinking maybe that there was something missing in that conversation, that the characterization of campuses as a hunting ground maybe left out the idea that sexual assault, which is such a common element of undergraduates' experience, is socially produced. That maybe it's not just the product of bad people. And leaving aside, Austin did a bad thing, no question about that. But maybe there's a social element, and thinking about our greatness in public health, right? Our greatness in public health is shaping the environment, not telling people to be better people. In fact, we have a terrible track record of impact when we focus on telling people to be better people. So thinking about how to square what we know about behavior in public health with the conversation. So there's a little moment of data here, quantitative data. The 1 in 4 and 1 in 5 are statistics that are commonly used in the media and by advocacy organizations. One source of that is the campus sexual assault study, which was funded by the Department of Justice in 2007. But these numbers go way back. So when Mary Koss did research that was published in Ms. Magazine in 1985, that's pretty much where she found that she only looked at women, but it was 1 in 4. So, and then the finding replicated yet again by the American Association of Universities study in 2015, which just points again to the fact that we have a problem. I'm not sure we need to keep documenting that we have a problem, because we know we have a problem. The AAU study found that 28% of female undergraduates had experienced what the category they label sexual misconduct. They found a highly elevated risk for queer students. But there's something missing here, because I think the focus on campus data suggests that this is just a campus problem. And in fact, whose bodies really matter? If all you knew about higher education was what you read in the New York Times, you would think that everybody went to an Ivy League school. So I think the focus on sexual assault in higher education misses sexual violence outside of higher education. If you remember, the title of this talk was 1 in 3. So the 1 in 3, I said 1 in 3 deliberately because part of my point here is that the persistent failure to move the needle on campus sexual assault reflects the focus on it as a campus problem, rather than thinking about sexual violence as an everyone problem. Data from the WHO suggests that about 1 in 3 women worldwide experience either physical or sexual intimate partner violence. If you look at data only in the US, whether from the NISPIS, from CDC, or from the YRBS, it's clear that it's a problem. It's not just a problem on college campuses. One thing, before I get to the research design, that I think is worth flagging is that one of the reasons that we're still here 50 years after this conversation began is because we've had a lot of social movement organizing on campuses in terms of pushing campuses to do better. But we haven't had a lot of social movement organizing pushing the government to do better. This is a slide from a paper I love in AJPH that points out the discrepancy between the amount of suffering quantified economically, which we could have a conversation about another day, but the amount of suffering due to different conditions and the amount of funding for research for those conditions. And you can see that, I mean, I don't know actually if you can read the labels, but the two areas in which there is a much more funding, that's the white bar, than suffering, that's the black bar, are cancer and HIV. And both of those are conditions that have seen really successful social mobilization to press the government for more research funding. So basically, part of the reason that we haven't done better on sexual violence prevention is because we haven't really tried. This slide is a little bit old, but this was from a systematic review of sexual violence prevention intervention. I trust that in the intervening years since this was published, several of you in the audience have developed new interventions. But when Sarah DeGue and her colleagues reviewed existing intervention research in 2014, they only found 3 that worked, out of only 140 that had actually been evaluated. So into that context comes SHIFT. As we were watching the national conversation about campus sexual assault and thinking that maybe we could do better at prevention if we understood the ecology of sexual assault better, I sidled up to someone at Columbia and said, hey, I've got an idea. And $2 million later, there we were. It's nice to work at a rich university. So Columbia very generously funded the study, and SHIFT had 3 aims. First, you gotta measure it. So first, to understand the prevalence of sexual assault and non-consensual sexual contact. Second, to understand the ecology of sexual assault. And then third, to actually do something with the research. As I said to the students when I met with them this morning, most research has no impact on the world. And we really wanted to do a little bit better with that. And so from the beginning, we took a CBPR approach within the university, which meant having 2 advisory boards, one of institutional sort of senior administrators and one of undergraduates. It was a very large interdisciplinary research team, which I co-directed with a clinical psychologist and my friend, Claudette Mellons. And there is a staff. It was really like, we built the plane while we were flying it, with a lot of people. So some of the framing concepts in SHIFT, first of all, as I mentioned, looking at the ecology of sexual assault. And some of the conceptual writing that I've done has articulated this idea of meso-level factors. So, there's not gonna be like a day that you wake up and fix gender inequality. I mean, maybe one of you will, but there's not gonna be a day that I wake up and fix gender inequality. But there are elements of social institutions that we can change. Whether it's gender inequality or racial inequality, looking at modifiable institutional level factors can, I think, mitigate some of the despair of a structural analysis. It gives you an actual thing to work on, so that even you can see that the picture is big and complicated. You're like, okay, this is my lane. I can at least do something. Taking a life course perspective. As a parent, I know that when students arrive on campus, they're already kind of cooked, right? They're like formed into humans. And so looking both through the survey research and the ethnographic research at pre-college experiences and how that shapes how people arrive on campus. Thinking about sex, this is my whole career. Sex is a social behavior, not just a health behavior. And so being attentive to the social risks and social benefits of what people do, taking people to be not rational actors, but situated in a culturally variable rationality where they have good reasons for doing things that can seem pretty stupid to outsiders. So giving them the respect of trying to understand why they're doing what they're doing. Young people get a lot of adults telling them that what they're doing is a bad idea. So we want to start from a different place. Thinking intersectionally, obviously multiple forms of inequality, cross-cut campus life. And then noting the particularities of American life. It's a terrible idea for young people to leave home at 18 to go off to college. That's not something that people do everywhere in the world. And so the idea of residential higher education in a country where the legal drinking age is 21, where higher education until pretty recently was an institution that existed to reproduce privilege for white, wealthy, heterosexual men. Like there's a context to these institutions. And so taking that context into account. This is a org chart of the shift study design. It was the ethnography, which is what I'm going to talk about mostly. 2 forms of quantitative research. We did a population-based survey, which got a 67% response rate. And we did a quantitative daily diary study, about which you can read in some of our published articles. And then we had a policy development arm, which was really focused on internal change. The advisory boards included, as I noted a minute ago, representation from all of Columbia's undergraduate schools, as well as some of the central offices of administration, and then we worked with a bunch of undergraduates, which was, I would say, one of the singular delights of the project. They're the ones who designed the logo, they're the ones who asked for the sweatshirts, they were our ambassadors on campus, they helped with their recruiting, they kept us from making so many mistakes, they reviewed all the instruments. For them, we met every Monday morning at 8 o'clock, which that's the hard thing to get undergraduates out of bed. But we gave them breakfast and we gave them respect. For many of them, we would bring them an instrument and they would say, no, you're asking this question all wrong, that's terrible. And so we would change it and bring it back the next week. And they were like, you listen to us. And so I think for them, the feeling of actually helping steer this giant thing was very gratifying. They wrote a paper about it. You can read the paper. So those are our 2 advisory boards. Little bit about the ethnographic methods. We did 151 in-depth student interviews and 26 follow-up interviews. The follow-up interviews were with students who had experienced so many assaults that there was not time in the first interview, or in some cases even in the second interview, to describe them all. 19 key informant interviews with student and administrative stakeholders, 17 focus groups, and more than 500 hours of participant observation. And so I just want to clarify that the we was Seamus Khan and I led a team. Most of student socializing happens long after I'm asleep. And it would be really creepy to see your professor at a party or in your dorm after hours. And so just so creepy, wrong, so many reasons not to do it. So too late at night. So we hired a team, not an undergraduate team, a team of either master's or doctoral level trained researchers. They were not spies. They always told students that they were doing research. And they integrated into campus life in various ways, attending religious services, joining an intramural sports league, hanging out where students hang out, and they were truly extraordinary. So the feeling that you have when you read Sexual Citizens of pulling back the curtain on what it's like to be a student in an elite institution of higher education, that's all them. Hats off to the team. The broad questions that we were looking at, one of the fun things about ethnography is you go in with some broad questions, and then you end up in a different place. If you don't end up in a different place, you weren't really paying attention. So we were interested from the beginning in what people are trying to accomplish through sex. I'll get to that more in a second. We're interested from the beginning because this is a question that has been a thread throughout all of my research in the social organization of space and how differential access to space shapes sexual and social life. What is really happening with consent? How do people actually do consent? Learning more about the ecology of alcohol. Thinking in a nuanced and sophisticated way about power relations among students. So what really counts as social power? The public conversation about sexual assault would have you think that all of the people who commit sexual assault are football players and members of fraternities. And it has to be more complicated than that. And so we wanted to be very attentive to what it means to be powerful on campus. What students are actually doing about sexual assault prevention. We have an interesting paper about some of the unintended impacts of bystander interventions, how students use the label sexual assault and how they avoid that label. We have another paper about the social risks of reporting. So those were some of the questions that we started the work with. And these are some of the ideas that we ended up with. The book is scaffolded by 3 key concepts: sexual citizenship, sexual projects, and sexual geographies. Sexual citizenship is the idea that people have the right to choose their own sexual experiences and that they need to know that other people have that same right, that other people are not human scratching posts for them to do whatever they want. Sexual projects answers the question, which you might think only 2 professors would ask, of what sex is for. Because it turns out that sex is not for having babies, not among any of the students with whom we spoke. It's not necessarily for pleasure, because a lot of sex that people have on campus is not particularly pleasurable. For some students, it's about, particularly for the queer students, it's about figuring out who they are. On occasion, it's about accruing social capital, so getting prestige either for yourself or for the group that you're a part of. Sometimes it's about expressing love and care for a partner. So those are some of the, so that's sexual projects. Sexual geographies is the idea that space is not just a backdrop for how people socialize, it's actually sort of a third actor. That the space to which people have access shapes how they interact in all kinds of ways. And this is important because like that is a thing that campuses can change. If you think this is just automatically advancing in a way that I find troubling, I'll just keep moving it back. It's okay. I am the master of this computer. If you think about the moment when the parties end, okay, now, I don't know, anyway, I'll just keep moving it back. If you think about the moment when the parties end and the bars close, students are funneled into spaces if they want to continue to talk, that have 4 pieces of furniture. They have a desk, a dresser, a desk chair, and a bed. And so where are they going to sit? They're going to sit on the bed. And or maybe one will sit on the floor, but they're more than likely they'll sit on the bed. And beds have a particular social meaning. And we could change that. Except the lounges at Columbia, all of them have chairs. I'll show you a picture. I'll show you a picture in a minute. Have chairs where only one person can sit. So there's no beaten down old leather couches that you can sit on and talk and maybe sit closer and maybe you sit further. So the furniture that furniture actually shapes the way that students interact. And that's just one example of sexual geographies. So Lucy's story, and this is sort of the classic story of campus sexual assault. When Lucy came onto campus, she'd gone to a boarding school. She had had very little experience with guys, and she had a clear plan for what she wanted to have happen socially in the first couple months of school. She wanted to meet some boys, she wanted to make out, and she wanted to eventually lose her virginity. So during orientation week, when students have a lot of time to drink and go to parties because there's not much else going on, I mean, there actually are a lot of scheduled activities, most of which they do not attend, a friend invited her out to a bar. And sure, It's not so hard to get into a bar if you're a pretty girl, even if you're 18. And so they waltzed right in. It was very exciting to meet these two senior guys. It was kind of thrilling. They were like big guys. They were, experienced, prestigious. Scott bought Lucy a drink. They danced. He invited her back to the fraternity. It seemed like everything was going just according to plan. As they're walking back, her phone starts to ring. Scott's like, let's keep going. She's like, wait, I want to see who it is. Clearly not my mom. She picks it up. It's her friend who had gotten the bystander intervention, wanted to make sure she was okay. So they wait for the friend outside the fraternity. They go up together. Scott asks the girls if they would like a drink. Fraternities are not allowed to serve hard liquor. It doesn't mean they don't do it. It just means they keep it upstairs. So they ascend to the second floor. He mixes them a drink. Lucy's friend passes out almost immediately. She really had a lot to drink, apparently. And Scott invites Lucy up to his bedroom. Does she want to go? Yes, she wants to go. So, it's all good until it wasn't. They're making out, and then he starts to unbutton her pants. And she was very clear. She said, no, don't. To which he said, it's okay. But it wasn't okay. And when she told us that story 2 years later, she had never told anyone that she was raped. She described it the next day to her roommate as just like one of those crazy things that happen when you lose your virginity to a total stranger. Because she felt like she should have known better. Like, she should have known that he was a senior and he was going to want to have sex. But no, right? And so when I tell that story, we are aware of how it lands. It lands in the, Scott is a terrible person, and we need to find people like that and get them out of our communities. And yes, what Scott did was a terrible thing. But our focus in Sexual Citizens is actually the context, and how the context is a sort of tipping point that produces experiences that produces scenarios like that, in which then people like Scott could have said, fine, when she said stop. And he didn't. So he clearly had a choice then. But our focus is how sexual citizenship, sexual projects, sexual geographies intertwine to produce that situation. So let me just unpack it for a minute. Scott was very clear about his own sexual citizenship, right? He knew where he was going. Totally not attentive to Lucy's sexual citizenship. So I think that you can see it's not just, he didn't just rape her, he erased her when she said stop, and he said it's okay. In terms of sexual projects, again, he knew where he was going. She had not grown up in a context that provided any opportunity to have a conversation about sexual projects. So she, in that, wanting to make out and eventually lose her virginity, just expressed the sexual project that she thought belonged to college, which was not, in fact, necessarily what she wanted to do. But the key thing is sexual geographies. Think about her walking up those stairs in a building where she'd never been, on a campus where she just set foot, because you can't have parties in the freshman dorms. And it's very hard to get alcohol and serve it to a bunch of people in a space where all of the rooms are doubles. So physically, you can't have parties. In terms of the way dorms are policed, you can't have parties. So first year students, and particularly young women, because it's normative for young women to hook up with older men, are funneled into spaces controlled by older men. So essentially, it's rooming policy and housing policy and liquor policy that together put Lucy in that room. And obviously, she walked up the stairs, so there is some element of agency there. But those campus sexual geographies, the idea that older students always have to have better housing than younger students, we could change that, right? I mean, the idea that space equals prestige is not limited to college campuses. I have seen colleagues cry over the size of their office because they feel like it doesn't reflect their level of importance. So space is power. What the corner office? But we could change that on college campuses. So that's an explanation of how those three ideas thread through Lucy's story. But sexual assault is not one thing, it's many things. What might prevent non-consensual, unwanted touching by a stranger is very different than what might prevent what Armstrong and her colleagues call campus party rape. So I want to tell two more stories, Charisma's story and Adam's story. So charisma described Columbia as a white space. And she meant by that it was mostly, the social scene was parties hosted by white guys who didn't find her attractive, she didn't find them attractive either, played terrible music, couldn't dance. So she's like, this socializing here is not for me. And so she went off campus one night to see a guy who she had met through her friend of her roommates. She took the subway out to Brooklyn, and I mean, Brooklyn is not far from Morningside Heights as the crow flies, but it was a rainy night, and the subways on the weekends, typically a nightmare, and so it was like a 2-hour sojourn to get there. She got there, they smoked a joint, had a little bit to drink, Netflix and chill, all good, until it wasn't. They were making out. He put his hands on her body. She moved the hands away. He put them back. She described it later as having sex 2 times. But she was very clear in all kinds of ways with him that she did not want to have sex. So that was an assault. The sexual geography idea, really, like you see how the whiteness of Columbia as an institution expels students of color or propels them off campus for socializing. He was very clear about his sexual project, but totally inattentive to her sexual project. Similarly, sexual citizenship, total disregard for charisma's sexual citizenship. And we saw in the research time and again so many moments in which cis hetero men failed to recognize women's sexual citizenship. So that is really an area in which we could do better. It's not just race, because it's also class. I mean, she was far from campus, but for a lot of students, for rich students, you're just like, open up your phone, call an Uber, and go home. But that was a $70 Uber ride without a tip. So there was no universe in which charisma had the capacity to escape Raymond's apartment when she saw things going south. I think it's also notable to think about the different role of alcohol. In the survey data, we saw that about half of the assaults that students experienced were perpetrated through alcohol. And that also means that half of them were not. And so the way that the public conversation around campus sexual assault turns again and again to campus party rape really centers the experiences, the experiences that are typically those of white women. And charisma's story, or stories like charisma's, of sexual assault that happens in the context of some kind of intimate partnership are left a little bit to the side. So one of the things that we try to do in Sexual Citizens is to decenter whiteness. Yes, certainly it's important to have prevention oriented towards alcohol, but of the Black women that we spoke with, every single one described unwanted, non-consensual sexual touching. I just want to underline that. Every single one. And they didn't even describe it in response to the question about if they'd ever been sexually assaulted. They described it in the context of talking about what it was like to be a student on the Columbia campus. And the point is not that Columbia is more racist than other campuses, is that is what it's like to go through life as a Black woman. I mean, like, newsflash, right? And so if we focus on that only as instances of sexual violence, rather than labeling it also as instances of anti-Black racism, then we're kind of missing the point, because that was how they experienced it. So I think widening out, like, we can't have one approach to prevention, because the thing that we're trying to prevent is actually many things. So that's a charisma story. Adam was not out to his parents, and had not gone to a school that had a gay-straight alliance, and had not grown up in a queer-affirming church, and was pretty excited to get to New York, where he thought it was going to be. He thought he was going to be like a kid with, in the candy store. And he got on Grindr and actually thought it was kind of gross, because he didn't want to just, hook up with guys who would ghost him the next day. Actually, like, some of those messages from his parents about sex needing to be in a relationship, like, that was actually his values. He wanted to be in a relationship. And so he was so happy when he found a boyfriend. And as he described it to us, it was great, except his boyfriend was sometimes kind of forceful, as he framed it, about sex, including an incident that he recounted to us where his boyfriend came back to his room really drunk and, in Adam's words, basically raped me. And the basically is just because students are very tentative about using that word. So it was something that Adam experienced as an assault. But what was he going to do? His boyfriend was like his port in a storm. His boyfriend was the thing that the relationship that he had always longed for. They had the same friend group. He wasn't going to accuse his boyfriend of sexual assault publicly. He didn't want to destroy the relationship, and he wasn't sure that if he did accuse his boyfriend, that the friend group they might choose the boyfriend and not him in terms of taking sides. So that's a story that that also may not figure prominently in how people talk about campus sexual assault, and that points to a very different set of prevention approaches. If Adam had grown up in a school with a gay-straight alliance, or if he had gone to a queer-affirming church, or if his parents had a home environment where he felt like he could be out to them, then maybe he would have felt like he deserved to be in a relationship where he could say no and be heard when he didn't want to have sex. And clearly, like, part of the problem lies with the boyfriend, right? Because he was the assaulter. So that boyfriend also never got some crucial messages about other people's sexual citizenship. So, so where does a focus on sexual citizenship point us? First of all, students are not blank slates. So there's so many ways in which sexual shame produced at home is part of the vulnerability to campus sexual assault. When parents say, "not under my roof," what they're saying is, I refuse to see you as a person who is growing into an adult who will have sexual intimacy with people. It doesn't keep their children from having sex. It just tells them that they can't ever talk to their parents about sex. I don't know if you know Amy Shallot has this great work comparing American families to Dutch families in terms of how they manage the sleepover. We're very pro sleepover, because really, if you want your children to have sex in the context of an ongoing, committed, supportive relationship, there's no better way to make that happen than to actually let them do it. So part of this starts at home. Students are not blank slates, and the denial and erasure of young people's sexual citizenship begins much earlier, when parents use words like pee-pee and hoo-ha as opposed to penis and vulva. They're conveying in a really powerful way that there's something about genitals that are so powerfully shameful that you can't even name them. Like, imagine if people did that about elbows. Like, you must not speak of the elbow. So the denial and erasure of young people's sexual citizenship goes deep. And even in schools where there is comprehensive sex ed provided, frequently what students hear is that this is how contraceptives work, and this is how you prevent sexually transmitted diseases, but really it would be better if you waited until later to have sex. So that message tells young people that they are not full sexual citizens. And we do, this is one of the findings, I would say my favorite paper from the Shift survey research, showed that women who had had comprehensive sex ed before college that included practice saying no to sex they didn't want to have, which is not abstinence-only sex education, it's just sex education that includes some skills development, like any good education, were half as likely to be raped in college. So, like, that was the target effectiveness we were hoping for with the COVID vaccine, right? That is we don't get effect sizes like that in social science. And yet we are making the policy choice in states all across America not to provide young people with that. So I think that's part of the focus on moving our anger from college presidents to our elected officials. A part of building a world in which young people feel comfortable saying no and are able to hear it when others say no is building a world that acknowledges and supports their right to say yes, which we are very far from. Colleges are also not magic islands that exist outside of other forms of social inequality. So think about, the many religious institutions through which young people pass that also undermine their sexual citizenship, particularly the sexual citizenship of queer young people. Think about how changes in access to sexual and reproductive health services, again, if you can't get the pill, if you can't terminate a pregnancy, the underlying message there is that you shouldn't be having sex. Sexual citizenship to us suggests that student voices for change should be pointed outside of campus. Not that campuses couldn't do better in many ways, but campuses are never going to fight the fight for comprehensive sex ed. That is a fight that is only going to be fought and won at the State House. And so students have so much power. I've been organizing in New York for comprehensive sex ed since I moved to New York in 2004. And every year we hear the same thing from legislators. We would like to hear from some young people. We're not interested in this if this is only a New York City issue. It has to be a statewide issue. And there don't seem to be very many people on your side. The other side is very loud. In New York State, the senator who sponsors the comprehensive sex ed legislation had to get an extra security detail and extra mental health support for her staff because of 4 people who follow them around to every single public event and scream at them that they're groomers. So, you know, the support, like, research has shown that there is actually strong bipartisan support, even among parents, for comprehensive sex ed. We just stink at organizing. So really, we have to all do better on that. And then I think we're just remembering that sexual assault is about power, that again, this can't only be a conversation about gender-based power. It has to be about multiple intersecting forms of power. Sexual projects. So where does sexual projects take us forward? Our point, this is the parents always want to know, like, well, what is the right sexual project for my kid? And I'm like, that is a you question, not a me question. I have an opinion about my own kid. But the point is not even that there's a safe sexual project and an unsafe sexual project, or that there's a right one and a wrong one. Like, that is a values conversation. It's that young people need spaces and institutions that provide opportunities to clarify what their sexual project is going to be. And that parents need to approach this, I have to say, with like a little bit of humility. I couldn't even ever get my kids to floss. So like I could say as much as I want about the kind of sex I think they should be having, and we have definitely had those conversations. And yet still, like, the whole point of raising children is that you teach them to take care of their bodies and not to step on other people's feet. And then they go out in the world and they move through the world and they make their own choices. I do think that we could do better at raising awareness about how the particular sexual project of having a lot of sex with people you don't know very well when you're drunk puts you at risk of raping people. Like, I think that is not a message that's getting to people. When we tell people not to drive drunk, we don't say, don't drive drunk because you might crash. We say, don't drive drunk because you might kill someone, right? And so reframing drunk sex as a risk practice and then taking a harm reduction approach, understanding this is something that people want to do. I mean, I don't know if you've ever been to a bar, but adults also want to have drunk sex. Like, it is a thing that people do because it's fun. And so I think rather than being all judgy about it, meeting kids where they are and saying, look, if you're going to do this, just sharing. So there's also, in terms of sexual projects, a whole other conversation that we could open up. I think about a story in the book. There were these two kids who were hooking up, and they had like a very good thing going. Like, you know, one would send a text from the library, and it was just about sex, and it was good for both of them. But then one of them crossed the line because his grandmother died, and he was really sad. And he asked the girl if he could come over just to talk. And she ghosted him. Because she was, as she said, she was down to talk, but she was not down for feelings. And you know what? Like, that's a complicated one because that was her choice. Like, she wasn't necessarily obligated to hear his feelings. On the other hand, maybe she's a terrible person. And so I think changing the conversation from here's how to have sex without breaking the law to like, what kind of sex do you want to be that's aligned with your aspirations as a human being? What do we owe each other in our interactions? I think that's a conversation that young people find much more engaging because it's about the kind of sex you want to have, not the thing I'm telling you not to do so you don't get in trouble. But the thing that we're really excited about is sexual geographies. The top is sort of, the top picture, that's like a typical Columbia lounge, which has all the charm of like an airport waiting room. But that's because students have pushed hard to reconfigure the lounges, which used to be full of like crappy old comfortable couches, into study spaces. Like, students want more study space, and so the lounges have been rebuilt as study spaces. The bottom picture is a dining hall. It's a dining hall cafeteria space. So back to the institutional advisory board. The person who was responsible for housing and dining, the vice president of facilities, always wondered what he was doing on our advisory board. He's like, this is not my topic. Like, I'm furniture, lawns, meals, what am I doing here? And then there was a moment when he got it. He was like, oh yeah, they go back to the bedroom because there's nowhere else to go. And so this is JJ's, and he decided to keep it open all night on the weekends because he's like, that's a thing I can change. Now, again, that was, staffing it was not free, but that is an environmental level change. That's where campuses should be focused. With so many ways that we discuss in the book in which the unequal allocation of residential and social space amplifies inequalities, racial inequalities, class inequalities, but also age inequalities. The power difference between a senior and a freshman is like the power difference between Jeff Bezos and an Amazon delivery person. Like, it is a vast power gap. And so we just make that worse when we create campuses where juniors and seniors dominate all the socializing space. So this is the lever we think that higher education should really be focused on. It does not need to be about building palatial new dorms. At Princeton, yes, actually they built a whole dorm. But like everyone, for all of the rest of us, it's about thinking about repurposing current space and changing policies that guide the allocation of space so that students who are socially less powerful have more access to space that they can control. So to help campuses do this, Seamus and I created the Sexual Assault Prevention and Campus Equity or SPACE Toolkit, which is a free, like, we're not selling anything. It's a free, it's not really an intervention. It's a guide for campuses to take account of and think about reimagining how space works on campus by bringing together the conversation about sexual assault prevention with the conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and people who are responsible for space planning. So that's the SPACE Toolkit. It has 4 steps. The first step is to commit, because the people who do sexual assault prevention are not the people who are in charge of space. And so they don't really have the power to move this forward on their own. We've asked the 12 schools that are beta testing this with us all committed at the level of like a letter from the president or the provost. The second step is to convene. So bring together a multi-sectoral group that includes students and administrators, maybe some faculty, and talk about what sexual geography means and how it applies to your campus. So that's considering when you sort of, it's like a rapid ethnographic mapping of the campus. And then change, like don't change everything, but find a thing to change and change it. One of the schools that we've been in conversation with, even before the SPACE Toolkit, like they got the memo and they decided to change their housing policy. So the best dorms had always gone just by tradition to the captains of the soccer and lacrosse teams, the 2 whitest teams, and they were like, oh, we can do better here. And so they decided that those dorms, those suites would go to the students with the highest GPAs, which was like 100% not the choice that we would have made. But it was, it was an incremental change. And anyway, so that is the SPACE Toolkit. So just a few concluding thoughts. This sort of systems analysis can feel overwhelming because basically what our argument is that sexual assault is produced by inequality and that we shouldn't look at campus sexual assault as separate from the sexual violence that happens in every other institution in which humans exist. So families and the military and religious institutions and sports and the arts, like everywhere there are people, there is sexual violence. And that's because we're like profoundly failing to raise people who understand how to have sex without hurting other people. Certainly there are people who commit sexual violence intentionally, and that is a much more complicated thing to talk about. That's not what I'm talking about. We're talking about people who, like, imagine there's a bicycle and there's a Hummer, and they're sharing the road together. The Hummer hits the bicyclist is dead, right? The people who drive the Hummers are failing, they don't see the ways in which driving the Hummer puts the bicyclist at risk. So I think that we could do so much better on that, and that's not a project of any one particular institution of higher education. It really is a project for all of us as citizens and voters. That's it. Comments, questions, complaints?
I don't really have a, I think it's on. I don't know if it's on or not. I don't know. Oh, well.
You can just ask it and I'll repeat it. While they're
So,
talking.
so I don't really have a question, but you sure did bring up some stuff I had never heard before. So thank you very much for that. Things that I had not ever even considered or thought about. The whole idea of geography and how the structure of space can have an effect on sexual assault. I had never heard anything like that. It was very, very eye-opening. I just wanted to thank you for that. Or anything else. And you got to actually, I was going to ask you a question at the end, but you said it, and so I go my question. So my question was that listening to what you were talking about sounded an awful lot like in the military also, and everything you hear about problems with sexual assault in the military. And then you said it at the end, so you kind of blew my question at the end. So, but if you want to comment on that, that'd be great.
I mean, we presented the space toolkit to the Air Force and the Space Force because they're thinking about the ways in which the physical setup of their installations is part of the social context. You know, Kirsten Gillibrand is running for re-election on the fact that she's changed adjudication practices in the military, which certainly were in need of improvement. But I think that there also, as far as I know, there's not really a robust conversation about ecological approaches to prevention. So I think that this, you know, nor does the military require that people have had sex ed before they enlist, right? Like that would be a very powerful signal. Like you need to read, and you need to be able to read, and you need to have received sex ed. So I think there are all kinds of ways in which powerful institutions can encourage policy change where it needs to happen, which is much earlier.
I would think that the military may actually be harder than colleges because the military is based on power. You know, you've got rank, and everybody knows who's above who, and trying to deal with all that issue may even be harder than seniors versus freshmen.
I think in every institutions, you know, talking to social scientists, like institutions operate through power and inequality. So whether it's like a priest or a commander or the quarterback or Harvey Weinstein, like in every context, we see people who have access to power in a way that is part of the situations that that produce assault. And I just want to be clear, I'm not letting the assaulters off the hook. Like they are making a choice. They do a bad thing. They should be held responsible. But as a population level problem, I think thinking about changing the environment, like this is not a problem we're going to solve one penis at a time. We have to think about the whole community context. Another question. I have to get that one penis at a time. I'm contractually obligated to get that in every time I talk.
I'll let someone else speculate about the significance of the fact that it's the two older white guys that are choosing to ask questions. So thank you for. I wasn't
going to say that, but yeah.
No, I just needed to point out the obvious. So first, thank you for bringing a public health lens to the issue. I mean, we, to your point, tend to focus on the behaviors and not the conditions that create the context for the behaviors. My question to you is about generalizability. I mean, you kind of started out talking about the New York Times and how if you read the New York Times, think everyone goes to an Ivy League school, and then based on tremendous opportunity and funding, did your study at Columbia. And I'm wondering, understanding that the statistics are across time and space, whether, kind of how you thought about the limitations around generalizability across different settings with more diverse student populations, broader range of economically privileged or less privileged students, and those kinds of things.
Yeah, I think that that's such an important question. So for ethnographic generalizability, the particularities of any context obviously are particular to that context, but what's generalizable are the ideas. So any campus context, you could map out the sexual geographies. They would be different in different places, but the idea travels. Similarly, in any campus context, you could think about providing spaces for students to articulate and clarify to themselves their sexual citizenship, their sexual projects. And in any context, through doing work on diversity, equity, and inclusion, you can uphold not just the sexual citizenship, but the citizenship of everyone on campus. So it's the ideas that are generalizable. Obviously, the Columbia environment context is very particular in so many ways. So it's an important question. Another question, comment? Is there a way to get questions from the Zoom? There is not, okay.
Thank you so much. One of the things that really struck me today and from your book was that every single Black woman reported non-consensual touching, and I know that that's not consistent with what we see in our sexual assault measures. And thinking about how do we know if we are making change and progress, and if our measures aren't capturing that, what do we do and how do we look at that moving forward? So hoping you have some insight.
I mean, I think that I'm not a survey researcher, so and I'm not a survey researcher, but I think that when we assess, like assessments that are focused only on sexual violence, as opposed to assessments that take a more intersectional approach and look also at, there was an article in the Chronicle earlier, I don't know, this week, last week, yesterday, what day is it, that reported on a Gallup study of 6,000 Black students. It said that 20% of them had experienced interactions, non-sexual interactions, I understood, of discrimination during their time in higher education. And it was higher in for-profit institutions and a little bit lower in public institutions, but 20% is a lot. And so I think a more intersectional approach means not just looking at the experiences of, like the sexual assault experiences of different kinds of students, but also taking seriously other forms of peer victimization. So I think also accounting for non-sexual anti-queer victimization and looking at the campus context in terms of racism. I think that that's important. And also, unquestionably, the 151 students who came in to tell their stories were not necessarily representative of the Columbia undergraduate experience. But they told a powerful story about one element of it. And I think it's also notable, let me just say one more thing, that think about the prominence of a conversation about campus sexual violence compared to the relative silence in terms of incidents of racist interaction on college campuses, where you get a sense that only at Oberlin and Antioch do they care about maybe. So I think that also in terms of whose experiences are centered in the problems that we're trying to solve.
We will end there, and just thank you everybody who joined us in person. We will have some reception time with Dr. Hirsch, so if you had a question that you just didn't want to ask in front of the whole group, there's a chance and opportunity to talk to her then. But thank you again for those who joined us, and thank you to those who joined us online, and a special thanks for Dr. Hirsch for coming down and seeing us here at JC.
Thank you, everyone.